The apostles come across this man who was born blind. Jesus comes up to them, and as they approach them, the apostles state, "Master, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Now instantly, because of our interpretational framework, we're going to say, oh, this is talking about some action that may have occurred in our pre-mortal state. Hello, welcome to another episode of the Missionary Brief. Previously, we've published several discussions about different topics, including how to read its scriptures more carefully, how to utilize the scriptures, and how to formulate and understand what we're reading by reading more carefully. And so I think today I was going to respond to a question some missionaries proposed to me a couple of weeks ago. They called me and they said, "Travis, how do we avoid misinterpreting scriptures? When we read scriptures, everybody brings to the text their own assumptions and beliefs prior to reading the text. It doesn't matter whether you're religiously inclined or not. If you meet an atheist in Minnesota or a Baptist in Mozambique, that person is going to be influenced largely by some religious and cultural paradigms, and those are usually the sources of their beliefs. So if they're an atheist, for example, even though they are an atheist, they're still going to be motivated or influenced by a religious paradigm into which they live or were raised. So one must have a knowledge of God before denying that God exists. And what I mean by that is if I'm raised as a Reformed Baptist, then my understanding of Christianity is going to be flavored by a Reformed Baptist perspective on the Bible. What I'm going to do is, when I talk about the scriptures or when I criticize them, I am going to do so from the lens of a Reformed Baptist. So that's what they're going to be thinking. I recently met with the missionaries to have a discussion a few weeks ago with a gentleman who wouldn't tell me what his religious background was. But based on some of the ways that he was responding to questions, I assumed that he was from a Protestant framework. He said, "My background doesn't matter. You should be able to answer these questions without understanding my paradigm." And I said, that doesn't really work. He was ignoring the presuppositions, the definitions that he had, and therefore any of the answers that I gave him were going to be talking past one another because I didn't understand how he understood, words like faith or etc., some of the simpler concepts, but certainly not any of the more complicated ones. So regardless of what he believed, he says, look, just ignore my belief system and answer my questions. So absent any understanding of his religious beliefs, I tried to present the answers to his questions, assuming an agnostic, historical scholarly perspective, where they remain unconcerned with arguing for or against any religious faith tradition, or one theology over another, as an interpretive framework for their understanding the text. So a historian who is, let's say, an agnostic historian, is going to bring a historical framework to the text. They're going to be concerned about what are these texts, who's the author, where did they come from. Whereas an ancient Israelite is going to have a much different framework. They're going to view the texts as Holy Writ, as something that's authoritative, legalistic, culturally important and relevant. And so that interpretive framework is going to color the way they read the text, very different from somebody who's looking at the text from a more objective perspective. Then you have, of course, the Israelites that we see who become Christians in the New Testament. Well, these followers of the way are messianic, so their perspective is going to reflect their messianic understandings. Now, where did they get their interpretive framework? Well, their theological interpretive framework comes from first John the Baptizer, or John the Baptist, and secondly from Jesus of Nazareth. So they're going to have this interpretive framework of a Messiah who is a divine figure who enters into mortality, and rather than being the kind of Messiah the ancient Israelites would have expected, and that the first century Jews were contending against Jesus to kind of reinforce, they're going to say, well, our interpretive framework is that this Messiah is not like a Moses who's coming in to liberate us in the same way Moses liberated us from ancient Israel. Instead, the first century Israelites who are following Jesus are going to look at their Messiah very differently. So that is going to be their interpretational framework for understanding the Hebrew Scriptures. They're not going to share the same paradigm. And so that's what's going to happen with them as they go through it. So we have examples of this framework being passed apostolically or through traditional leaders of the Christian movement, the movement of the way, as it's called in Acts 9. So we have this interpretational framework that starts with Jesus' closest followers, being shared by him to them, and then they spread that interpretational framework to those who are not of the Israelite tradition. So they are being taught that as their interpretational framework. So they're going to read the scriptures of Israel in a very different way than a Jewish convert is going to read the scriptures of Israel. I think that's why we see things like in Galatians, where we have disagreements about issues like circumcision. So we know in Genesis 17, Abraham received the command that in order to enter into a covenant with Israel, whether you were Jew or Gentile or you're brought into the community, you must be circumcised to be part of the community. So if I'm an Israelite and I am reading the scriptures of Israel and I have the messianic framework that the Messiah is going to be like Moses, not a divine character, but somebody who's selected by God the way Moses was, then certainly I'm not going to alter God's revealed word that's found in the Hebrew Scriptures. Whereas Paul is saying, my interpretational framework is revelation from God, and I am telling you, based on this revelation, that we are doing away with the physical act of circumcision, and we are replacing it with a circumcision of the heart, more of a metaphoric or symbolic circumcision, that comes with obedience to Christ and belief in Christ. So these interpretational frameworks are very important. So when I was talking to this gentleman who wouldn't tell me his framework, it became very difficult because I had to guess. So what I did is I started concluding, okay, fine, let's go at it from the agnostic historical perspective. And I started presenting the biblical texts in the way that a biblical scholar who has no religious dog in the fight, he's not a Jew, he's not Orthodox, he's not a Christian, he's not a Hindu, he's not anything like that. Instead, he's just somebody who's looking at these as ancient historical documents. That person is going to have a very different perspective on what ancient Israel's religion is than will be somebody who is a Jew or a Protestant or a Catholic. And so their interpretational frameworks are going to be something that's born out of the tradition into which they find themselves. So as a Latter-day Saint, we have our own interpretational framework, and we need to be sensitive and aware of that. So when you're talking to somebody who's not of our faith, you have to understand their paradigm. Hopefully, they're not contrarians like this gentleman I'm talking about, and they actually tell you, this is what I believe, and here's how I understand things. Now, I caution anybody engaged in missionary work not to make this mistake. And the mistake is, I often get calls and say, what do Protestants believe? What do Baptists believe? What do Seventh-day Adventists believe? What do Catholics believe? And my answer always is, I don't know that it matters that you know that before talking to them. Because again, you're not joining the conversation to demonize their beliefs. If you want to know what they believe, which may differ from the mainstream beliefs, the traditional historic beliefs of that faith tradition, if you want to know what they believe, ask that person, because their understanding of those doctrines is what matters, not necessarily what's born out of the tradition. So, from a Protestant perspective, for example, their interpretational framework is going to be born out of Christian tradition, the development of the creeds, which are formulations by wise and inspired and scholarly men who are not claiming that they are receiving the kind of public revelation that we have in the first century with the apostles. So their interpretational framework is the Bible is the ultimate authority, but we can read the Bible and we can discuss it, and individuals receive the gift of the Holy Spirit to help them to align themselves with each other. That's going to be their framework. A Latter-day Saint, on the other hand, is going to say, look, God speaks. We each have our own understanding of the Scriptures. For me, so Travis has what he needs out of the Scriptures as he reads and studies them. But that doesn't mean I get to declare the doctrine of the church, which is funny because some of the comments that are provided in some of my prior videos are, I don't think I like your ideas. I don't think I like your positions. What I'm trying to do is I am trying to identify what I understand is mainstream beliefs within the church, and also identify peripheral ideas that are not accepted as doctrine. It does not mean those ideas are incorrect. What it means is that those ideas are other frameworks in which an individual may take what we have revealed and filling in what we don't have revealed with their understanding. But what's within these broader frameworks, what is the purpose of them, is to create cohesion. And I'll give you a good example of that. In the first century, the Israelites, it was very common, and when we read about Jesus in the Gospels, we often see the Pharisees and the Sadducees arguing with Jesus and contending against him. And that seems like, oh, that's hostile. But from an Israelite perspective at that time, it was not unusual for them to publicly disagree and debate. But what they had is they had a shared interpretational framework, meaning God had revealed through prophets. We have written historical texts. We understand those texts. So when Jesus said, Moses said, Abraham taught, Isaiah stated, those he was talking to didn't have to have that explained to them. They knew the framework because they had a shared framework, even though there were disagreements on minor issues within their framework. The same thing happens in most communities. So in a Latter-day Saint context, that same principle applies. Latter-day Saints have a church that is founded on faith in Jesus Christ and a strong belief that he is our Savior. That is the foundational principle of the LDS Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now, outside of that, we have other core foundational principles. There was a restoration of authority to perform the actions or ordinances that are the covenant-making actions, like baptism, at confirmation, and receiving our endowments and other temple work. There's another idea that's found within Latter-day Saints that's very important, and that is we have modern revelation. So we have authority and we have revelation. That revelation is housed within the foundation of the church, which is apostles and prophets, which Jesus laid. So that is our framework. So if I disagree with Brother Johnson about a specific doctrine, and I can't find any teachings from our leaders on it, well, then Brother Johnson and I can just simply disagree. But what we can do is, because of our shared interpretational framework, we can read the scriptures, we can point to, we can use common languages, because that framework is what develops a society within us. This is what we see happening in the New Testament. Paul is writing letters to try to make corrections of disagreements amongst the saints, but he's doing so not telling them that, you're kicked out of the group. He's doing so to say, okay, this idea we understand, this is revealed. I want to address these important issues. I want to make sure that there's not disunity within the saints. And that's one of the primary functions of Paul as a leader and as an apostle. But we, as Latter-day Saints, we can certainly disagree, but we need to maintain doctrinal cohesion about the points of our doctrine that are revealed and are core to our understanding. And I want to give one more quick example to this. An interpretational framework, whether it's revelation, the Bible alone, or whatever, can provide you with a shared language for understanding certain passages. Some people might say that this is eisegesis. Eisegesis is, I have an understanding and I'm reading it into the text. Now, here's the difficulty with that. In John chapter 9, verse 1 and 2, the apostles come across this man who was born blind. Many people are familiar with this story. Jesus comes up to them, and as they approach them, the apostles state, Master, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now, a lot of people, when they read that, they just kind of gloss over it. But from a Latter-day Saint perspective, we're going to hone in on that and say, he was born blind, and they're asking if he sinned, and that caused him to be born blind. Now, instantly, because of our interpretational framework, we're going to say, oh, this is talking about some action that may have occurred in our pre-mortal state, our pre-existent state, because Latter-day Saints have a belief in a pre-existent that undercuts that. Well, other traditions are going to maybe look at that and actually have no answer to it, because they're going to say there's no context clues, there's nothing in the text that identifies it, and we don't believe in ongoing public revelation. So Latter-day Saint can say, yeah, the text itself, and this is exegesis, which is just taking the text at face value, reading it properly in context, and you can say, yep, we don't know exactly what they're referring to. Maybe they were wrong and Jesus rebukes them. That's not in the text, but you could conclude that. But what we have is we have Jesus saying, neither did this man sin nor his parents, that he was born blind. So Jesus' response isn't, what are you talking about? How could a man sin before he's blind, before he was born? But rather, no, he didn't sin before he was born, before he was born, and that's why he's blind, and neither did his parents. He's just saying nobody sinned to cause this, and says, but that the works of God might be made manifest. So he's blind so that I can show you the power of God. That's why he's blind. Doesn't refute the idea that he could have done something before he was born to cause his blindness, but simply doesn't mention that or talk about it. So there is an understanding amongst the Jews and amongst the followers of Jesus and Jesus himself that that question didn't need more expansion. And in fact, we see that in the writing of John, that the author of John also understood that and believed his audience would also get that and not ask a lot of questions about it. But because we're far removed from that culture, Latter-day Saints believe that the interpretational framework or the underlying context had to be restored. And that's why we appeal to modern prophets and modern revelation. So in talking about these things, we need to understand that we shouldn't be plugging our flag in the ground and saying, I'm holding my ground on this thing, when that thing is not a clear doctrine that is taught uniformly and unanimously amongst the brethren, has been taught publicly, and is found clearly and plainly in the available materials. So one of the warnings that I think that's been issued is, if we have to go find a doctrine in some obscure manual from 74 years ago, that's probably not the doctrine of the church. Those could be just the ideas of the person who issued those statements. So we need to make sure that as Latter-day Saints, we understand that we can have a shared framework, we can disagree on some points of ideas or doctrines or philosophy, but we need to adhere and be coherent and have cohesion in our interpretational framework, that we as individuals can receive revelation for me as to how to run my life and those underneath my stewardship, like my children, but also that I am subjected to God through his living prophets and oracles. So hopefully that's kind of the answer I gave the missionaries, and I hope that that will help you to look at different faith traditions with not only more grace and less judgment as to how they interpret things, but might facilitate an understanding amongst us that those differences exist. But Latter-day Saints need to focus on our framework and sharing that framework and doing so coherently and consistently. But I'm so grateful for the opportunity that I have to share these ideas and to have people who care enough to watch these videos. And again, I really love comments and any questions you have. I promise you we'll get to them. Maybe not all of them, but we'll get to as many questions as we can. And that'll help to keep this channel going as I'm able to answer questions by people who watch these and trust me to do so. Anyway, thanks.